Our first staff reader is Jonathan Bohr Heinen.
I wrote all this down somewhere. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thanks to Gwen and Adam and the whole staff. Y'all are amazing. Thanks to Wyatt, who first hired me here, and finally thanks to Leah for having me back. There's literally nowhere else in the world I'd rather be than here right now. I'm going to read from the middle of a historical novel I've been working on for a while. It's set in the spring of 1937 and told from alternating points of view. The first is Sarah Billard, a 15-year-old whose dreams of escaping the drought that plagues the Oklahoma Panhandle are stymied by her father, Joseph, who resorts to increasingly desperate measures to save their withering crops. The second perspective is Eugene Lugoff, a con artist who, along with his younger sister Ruby, flee a failed robbery in Santa Fe that left a man shot dead and Ruby badly injured. While putting distance between themselves and the crime, they're waylaid in the Panhandle by a dust storm. Running low on cash, their car broken down, they offer to help alleviate the drought, claiming they can coax rain from the sky with rockets. Much to Sarah's concern, her father takes them up on their offer. It's called Empire Dirt. Onlookers had gathered at the southwestern quarter, men, women, and children happily milling by the barbed wire, waiting for the show to begin. Sarah couldn't blame them for wanting to watch, but when she saw people by the fence wielding open umbrellas, she gathered that some hadn't come to see the rockets, but to ridicule her daddy's desperate attempt for rain. She spotted the rockets propped against the barbed wire and led her daddy away from the onlookers to see them more closely. She expected them to resemble something from Flash Gordon, but the rockets Mr. Lugoff made were homespun, looked like rolling pins fastened to yardsticks. Fuses trailed out of them like loose fishing line. "Is that what you thought they'd look like?" she asked. Her daddy said, "I don't know. I guess I didn't give it much thought." Mr. Lugoff approached the barbed wire, the stand of wheat behind him. He pointed to the thin clouds creeping toward the sun. "These conditions are encouraging. The first rocket is in position." He took a lighter from his pocket, handed it to her daddy, and held the fuse he'd trailed in from the field. "Why don't you get us started?" Without any fanfare, her daddy flicked open the lighter and dragged his thumb down the flint wheel. He put the flame to the fuse, and a cluster of sparks skidded across the ground and fled into the field. Out in the wheat, the rocket whooshed, leaving a trail of exhaust as it climbed. It exploded, the boom echoed, and light bloomed among the skim milk clouds. Up and down the fence line, the onlookers clapped and cheered. Her daddy gave back the lighter. Mr. Lugoff gathered the remaining rockets and said, "For the rest of the launches, I'll be responding to the variables, firing only when humidity, dew point, and temperature favor our efforts the most." Her daddy asked, "What should we do?" "Just keep looking up," Mr. Lugoff said. Then he wandered back into the wheat, the rockets stacked in his arms like a bundle of kindling. The sun gleamed in the open blue sky. With nothing more to do but wait and sweat, they wandered down the line and traded pleasantries with the onlookers. But Sarah was wary of everyone. She cut short the exchanges and tried to keep her daddy moving. She would have steered him away from Mr. Cobb altogether, but he stepped right into their path. He said, "I never imagined something like this happening here." Her daddy was staring at the sky, trying to catch the far-gone traces of light from the first explosion. "It's different than I expected it to be." Mr. Cobb asked, "Where's the rain?" "Well," her daddy said, "it's not like pricking a finger and drawing blood. The man warned us there might be a lag." Mr. Cobb turned to her daddy and said, "Makes you wonder, though. How long's the lag?" Her daddy squared up with him. "Is there something you want to say?" "Easy," Mr. Cobb said, holding up his hands. "I'm just what?" He stared at her daddy for a moment and said, "Nothing. Just forget it." He put his hands in his pockets, lazily rocked forward on the balls of his feet a few times and said, "I better leave you to it." As he strolled away, her daddy scoffed, "It ain't like I don't know what he thinks, what just about all of them must think. But I can't worry about what's going on in anyone else's head but mine. Cobb wouldn't risk a toe to save his foot. The rest are no better. But we've still got something at stake." There was a fizzling in the field. A rocket raced into the sky like it was headed for the vault of heaven, but it lost momentum, coasted to a disappointing zenith, and burst below the clouds. By the fifth or sixth rocket, the onlookers were coming and going. The sun shined through the shattered clouds. A soft breeze brushed by, and the wheat swayed. Another rocket rose from the field. It didn't climb far before it went off course and spun toward the horizon in unpredictable spirals. It finally struck far out in the field, the sound flat and heavy like a flour sack hitting the floor. There was hardly a chance to register the misfire. A few more rockets soared into the sky and exploded. The booms echoed, the lights faded, the trails of exhaust spread and would soon vanish. They all watched and waited. Then there were whispers. Deep in the field, smoke swelled. Her daddy said, "Shit." He took off for the pickup. Up and down the fence line, people yelled fire. Her daddy rushed back, shovel in hand. She parted the barbed wire to help him through. More men fled to their trucks on the shoulder of the road and returned with hand tools. She waved them on. Then she grabbed the hoe from the bed of the pickup and followed them. There were only a few flames at first, but they grew fast. Her daddy and the other men tried to smother them, but the flames spread quickly and joined into an awful blaze. Her daddy drew loops in the air with his finger and yelled, "Cut it off." They formed a loose circle and dug. While the fire cracked and hissed, they hacked away, raising dust and cut trenches, carving a fire break to keep the flames from spreading. Heat rolled over them, but they bore down, panting and coughing as smoke filled the air. Soon a haze settled around them, and they dug near blind until the fire break was finished. Propped on the handles of shovels and hoes, skin streaked with ash, dirt, and sweat, they watched it burn. Sarah walked the perimeter with her daddy. The flames healed to the fire break, and the better part of it went out after a while, but embers still smoldered beneath a blanket of ash. When the smoke began to thin, Mr. Lugoff appeared from the haze. He approached them calmly and said, "I'm sorry, Joseph, it was an accident, truly." Her daddy nodded, rubbed his eyes. Mr. Lugoff stepped forward, cautious and slow. "You know what we're trying to achieve here," he said. "Don't let this little setback discourage you." "Setback," Sarah said. "This whole field could be burning right now, but it isn't. And worrying about what didn't happen won't make it rain. We have almost a dozen more rockets to go." "You want to keep at it?" her daddy asked, "after this?" He shook his head and said, "Good God. If you would just relax and listen," but before he could finish, her daddy smacked Mr. Lugoff in the stomach with the shovel. He crumpled to the ground, belly down and gasping. Her daddy tossed aside the shovel and said, "I need air." Then he started walking toward the fence line. Mr. Lugoff lay on the ground groaning. The men left him behind in the ashes and dirt. When Sarah returned to the fence line, the crowd had grown. More people had come to watch the fire than there'd been to see the rockets. They held half-empty sacks of peanuts and sunflower seeds, had been standing there eating, cracked shells scattered at their feet, watching the fire burn like it was a movie. They pointed to the field where the flames had been. Nothing there now but the slow ascension of smoke. She found her daddy far down the fence line with his friend, Roman Hull. "I could see the smoke all the way from the filling station," he said. "Didn't figure it was a controlled burn." Her daddy told him, I don't know what the hell I was thinking, getting mixed up with that man. If it weren't for some good hands to help with the digging, there's no telling how far it might have spread." He coughed a few times, then he smirked and said, "I could sure use a drink about now. If I had one with me, it'd be yours." "Goddamn," her daddy said, "I wish you did." Sarah appreciated that he had Mr. Hull to confide in, but the onlookers were beginning to glance, and her daddy didn't need to suffer their curious looks or questions. The two of them would be better off alone in the field until the crowd thinned. She put her hand on his shoulder. "The fire's still smoldering," she said. "We should probably tend to it." He nodded wearily. Mr. Hull told her, "You take care of him." She said, "I will." Then she helped her daddy through the barbed wire and led him back into the wheat. They circled the burn site for another hour or so. The wheat straw glowed with heat and grayed to cinders. There were flare-ups, but there was nothing to do about them but watch the flames dance in the ashes until they died. Every so often, sparks popped into the air and drifted past the fire break. They stomped them to keep them from catching. When it looked like the fire was finally out, they stirred the ashes. They were exhausted, ready to head home, eat, and rest, but another flare-up appeared. Her daddy strode toward it and tried to smother it, but the flames licked around the blade of the shovel. He dug a scoop of ashes and dumped them on the flames, but they kept burning. He stood there for a few ticks, hunched over, head bowed, then he raised the shovel into the air. He whipped the flames and the sparks rained around him. After a few heavy blows, the flames buckled and she yelled, "You've got it, it's out." But he kept swinging, striking the same spot again and again like he was trying to beat it to death. Sarah wasn't inclined to stop him. He needed to exercise the sadness, frustration, and disappointment. He battered the spot until the shovel broke, and then he stood there holding nothing but the handle while the blade tumbled across the ashes. When it came to a rest, he wandered out of the ash bed, crossed the fire break, and kept walking. She asked him, "Where are you going?" He tossed the broken shovel handle aside and said, "To hell with it. I'm through." They didn't get home until dusk. The sun dipped below the horizon and the sky around it blazed. Her daddy hadn't said a word since they'd left the southwestern quarter. Now they got out of the pickup and made their way toward the house. On the back steps, there were a few cans of Falstaff beer. Her daddy said Roman must have left them for me. Then he sat down on the steps, picked up a can, and pulled a knife from his pocket. "Come inside," Sarah told him. "Get cleaned up." He stabbed a hole in the top of the can and said maybe later. She went into the kitchen, filled a basin with water, and grabbed a washcloth. She closed the door to her bedroom and stripped in the dark. It could have gone worse, she thought. She cupped her hands, wet her hair, and wrung it dry. The fire wasn't nothing, but it hadn't spread too far. She soaked the washcloth, cleaned her face and neck, and dragged it across her chest. Even if it had caught the whole quarter on fire, she wasn't sure how much it mattered. The wheat wouldn't have made it anyway. She wet the washcloth once more and ran it down her arms and legs. She felt bad for her daddy, but she hoped the situation had knocked some sense into him. She wrung out the washcloth and draped it over the lip of the basin. Water dripped around her feet. Her hair still stank of smoke. She put on her flour sack dress and went back into the kitchen. The stove was cold. She hadn't expected they'd be gone so long. She raised the lid off the pot and dipped her finger into the stew. It was warm enough. She grabbed a couple of bowls from the cupboard. She kicked an empty beer can off the step, sat down, and handed her daddy a bowl. "Eat," she said. "You'll feel better." He set the bowl on the step below him, raised his beer, and told her, "I'm already feeling better." She said, "Suit yourself." Night fell while she ate. Shadows emerged, and everything around them turned gray. Her daddy drained his beer, set the empty can aside, and opened the last one. He slurped the suds and asked, "I ever tell you what brought me out here with your mother?" "You saw an ad in the paper, didn't you?" He nodded. "That's right." Then he swept his hand through the air and said, "Prime land, come to the plains, a few dollars now, a farm forever." He took a drink and told her, "We were in Fayetteville. I was punching a clock at the cannery while your mother did paperwork for the school district. We'd been there a few years, had some savings, and the thought of a place of our own sounded better than good. We talked about it, your mother and me. But can you guess whose idea it was to come here?" He sighed, breath wavering as if he were on the brink of tears. He took a gulp of beer and told her, "Seemed like a good idea at the time." Not much had gone the way he would have liked, not lately, maybe not ever. And she wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but it wouldn't, not the way he hoped. She nudged the bowl of stew across the step and said, "It's getting cold. Eat." He finished the last of the beer, set down the empty can, and said, "All I ever wanted was..." Then he slapped his own hand like he'd been bitten or stung. He stared out at the lot. The dirt was dotted like the shell of a fresh egg. More flecks appeared on the plain of gray, a soft rain speckling the lot until everything beneath the sky was a darker shade of gray and wet. He turned to her, the ash on his face streaked with rainwater. He tried to speak, but she couldn't understand a word he said. Rain fell, soaking her hair and dress. She imagined it falling on the southwestern quarter, washing away the ashes and relieving the wheat. It had been some time since they'd seen it, and she knew it would be some time before they saw it again. But right then, the rain was falling. It gathered in small puddles that reflected the light of the moon. Her daddy said, "The man did it." Then he looked up at the dark sky and wept. Though the rain was nothing but an unwitting mercy of nature, credit would go to Mr. Lugoff. Sarah hated him for it, hated that her daddy had let it happen. He wept, and she looked out to the lot. The rain came down like silver ribbons. She felt a knot in her throat, an ache in her chest, and suddenly she was weeping too. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. So yeah, I'd like to also echo everyone's sentiments, which is that I feel very lucky to be here. So thank you, Leah. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Adam. Thank you to the rest of the staff for just being wonderful, amazing, fun people. And thank you everyone for being here. So I'm going to read from my novel in novellas called Los Perdidos, which centers around a made-up town in Mexico called Posada that attracts people who are lost, adrift, or troubled in some way. I'm going to read from the second novella, the opening pages of the second novella, and I think you'll get a sense of the protagonist's state of mind, as well as what draws her to Mexico, ultimately. A couple of other notes. Each novella plays with different elements of genre. This one probably, I would say, uses conventions of horror, so something to look out for. And then there's a mass suicide that's referenced a lot. It's not Jonestown. It's a made-up one. I think that becomes clear, but I just thought I'd mention it. Okay, it's called El Perdido. It's written in like journal entries or a sort of log, so each entry is dated. September 19th. Through the open window, I hear Mark paddling back and forth across the courtyard small pool. Sometimes he's out of sight. When he returns, I'm surprised by the image he calls to mind, a small water buffalo, skinned pink and shimmering under a pale moon. We share the courtyard with the hotel's 12 suites, and I wonder if each sleepless guest is as attuned to Mark's swim as I am. Were this any night but our last, I would call him to bed, but at this point, there's little consequence to whatever bridges we burn. When Mark does pull open our door, he'll be soaking wet and stinking of chlorine. He'll take a shower. We'll pack instead of have sex, both feeling the slight bafflement of something come to its inglorious end. Or maybe the failure of this trip is mine to shoulder, and I'll be the only one tossing in the darkness, sifting through my gathered bits of usable information as if in touching them I can force them to multiply. The article I proposed was vague to begin with. Visit the site of one of the world's largest mass suicides and follow its economic impact. But the circus I pictured wasn't here. A guide took us, me and Mark and an older British couple who each laughed at the same high pitch, into the Nicaraguan jungle. He stopped when we arrived at the site, and the four of us looked around, unsure of ourselves. Mark held his camera up to his face, then lowered it from the indistinct clearing. Maybe, at some point in the 60 years since the suicides, some physical trace, some spiritual force, some guidepost remained here. But now, all I felt was the emptiness of the space around us, an emptiness that spurred the realization that the something I had come for turned out to be nothing. If I stay up a little longer, I can reason the appropriateness of pairing suicide and nothingness, a potentially oversimplified yet potentially profound cause and effect. However, this wouldn't justify to the university's various review boards the cost of the trip, the investment of funds and resources and goodwill, nor does it have any place in my discipline and career. Were I to determine whether suicide is a response to nothingness or the method toward achieving it, the answer would be of little, if any, economic value. So instead, I'll put my pen aside, I'll strip down and join Mark in the pool, cast under moonlight, surrounded by tropical shrubbery. I'll join him in paradise before it dissolves before our eyes. September 20th. We sped through our morning until we arrived at the airport. Through it all, I felt something nagging in pursuit. I asked Mark 3 or 4 times whether it was possible we'd forgotten something, and each time he assured me we had everything we needed. Eventually, I understood that even if we turned back, whatever I felt was missing would not be waiting in the room. At the gate, Mark set his bags down and went to get us something to eat, leaving me in a trance of unease, at a loss, unable to stop shaking my head in self-admonishment. Then the British couple approached. It took me a moment to recognize them so far removed from the jungle. Though that was our only previous encounter, they were jovial when they greeted me. We had, I suppose, traveled from one hemisphere to another, drawn by the same scene of disaster. Therefore, their wide smiles proclaimed, we shared something unexpected, perhaps a fascination that ran against the stream of polite society. But after a while, their faces changed, probably because of what they saw in mine. The woman leaned in, and I thought she was about to press her lips to my forehead, the way my mother used to take my temperature when I was a child. She said at a subdued volume, "What's wrong, my dear? You look a little despondent, if you don't mind me saying." I told them the whole story, pushing it out with force in order to block my tears. My position at the university was insecure and tentative. This article was supposed to mark my breakthrough in the world of scholarly economics. I had been fascinated with the suicides for a long time, and I thought this genuine fascination would lead to a breakthrough in my discipline. But breakthrough was too lofty a goal, and now I didn't even have the bare minimum, which was the material for something passable, the inspiration to even aspire to the stunted pedestal of mediocrity. At some point, Mark returned carrying cartons of food he had the presence of mind not to open as I vented. When I finished, the British man told me he understood my dilemma, but with a good night's rest, maybe a few such nights, he was sure I would find a way to piece something together. I nodded but didn't say anything. Then the British couple explained their own interest in the suicides. They'd both grown up in big families, so the suicides fascinated them in part for the very fact of their coordination. How was it possible that 45 people of all different backgrounds could not only come to the same conclusion, but could abide that conclusion in the space of the same second? It was, they said, a marvel of synchrony. Then there was the fact that Neville, the British man, and Lana, the British woman, had both experienced suicidal family members. In both cases, those suicides were the defining moments of their respective childhoods. A suicide, they said, presents an infinite series of difficult questions, and the mass suicides felt, rightly or wrongly, like the suggestion of an answer, a suggestion of what it would take to fill the space of those colossal hows and whys. When they finished, I wondered whether I should share my own story, fill the outline of my own fascination, but I couldn't bring myself to open up to people I hardly knew, so Neville and Lana continued, saying that, in addition to everything else, there was the man who helped orchestrate the suicides, Alva Moore. People peg him as a model of cowardice, the mastermind who lived to flee, Neville said, but there's so much more to the man. They said they'd been looking into him for a long time now. Alva was another member of the Depression Support Group, whose numbers formed the majority of the 45 people who participated in the suicides. Those who endow Alva with sinister intentions suggest he was the one to present the idea, that he duped the others into willful death, that he convinced them to recruit, took their money, then fled. But the truth, according to Neville and Lana, according, they said, to a compendium of official facts and those, in a sense, less official, was that Alva, as orchestrator and survivor, was merely a component of necessity. With all those people desperate for a way out, one had to stay behind to ensure clean and safe passage. "I hope we aren't upsetting you, dear," Lana said, putting her wrinkled hand on my knee. "Oh yes," Neville said. "Please stop us if we're upsetting you. All of this is simply to say we're on an Alva-inspired tour. We're following his journey, starting at the site of the suicides and continuing on to Mexico, where Alva went next." I again pictured that empty clearing in the jungle. I asked them what they thought of it. Hadn't they expected more? Hadn't they expected it to be marked and commemorated, perhaps to the extreme? Hadn't they, like me, assumed there would be a vein of touristic capital pumping away down there, and now, having seen no such vein, didn't they feel as though they, the assumer, were cynical, perhaps so disconnected from humanity they barely belonged to it? "I would have guessed there'd be a plaque," Lana said. "Maybe a statue, maybe a roped-off ditch, a reminder of absence." "But people do like to forget," Neville said, shaking his head. "Most don't like to be reminded of the extremes of human behavior, and those who don't need to be reminded, like us, tend not to need the spectacle." At some point, they took out a small map of Central America. They traced the alleged path Alva traveled, and they told the story: the authorities he outran, the border patrols he bribed, the caravans he stowed away in. Prior to the suicides, he found a way to set up an escape plan that involved a city called Posada, where there existed at the time a criminal underbelly so large no one would dare come look for him. And that's where he lived out his life, in secret and silence. The quality of that life, they said, was what intrigued them, not its luxuries or squalors, but the quality of the inner life he lived. Had he found the peace we all find at the end, or had he taken on the loud, squealing pains of those he brought to rest? They'd heard conflicting stories so conflicting and so equally valid seeming that it was as though he had embarked on two separate existences and possibly many more there in that small dot along the eastern coast of Mexico. When the time came, they said their goodbyes and left for their own gate. Mark and I were still and silent until he remembered the cartons of food in his lap. He lifted mine in offer, eyebrows arched, a communicative gesture that would have been more appropriate to two people who don't speak the same language. I realized then that I couldn't return like this. 2 weeks in a remote Nicaraguan village with a man who, upon arrival, felt like another adornment to the wonderful life I had made for myself. A scholar traveling for research, someone of purpose and value, ended, if it were to end now, with both of us becoming parodies of our worst selves. I'd invited Mark, whose discipline was in the humanities, not because I thought he could contribute academically, but because I wanted his companionship, his company, the warmth of his body as I slept in a strange bed in a country to which I had no connection whatsoever. That he was smart and well accomplished in his field only helped justify his inclusion as someone off whom to bounce balls of academic inquiry. But then, over the course of 2 weeks, I'd watched as this man I admired began to shed the layers of his intelligence and virility, as he revealed his core imbecile, which was never more visible than when he held up that carton of food. If he could see himself at that moment, he would have shuddered at the person he'd become, just as I did when I caught the vehemence and anger lacing my words, fouling the space between us. I told Mark I had an idea to salvage the trip, assuming he'd recoil. Instead, he seemed to perk up at the idea of changing our flight, going to Posada, pushing back the end line of this excursion and seeing what could come from a few more days lingering in uncertainty and myth. He did the calculations, finger to his palm, and announced how much of the grant money was left, how long it could sustain us. He traced our days in Posada, 3, which would have us back home by the weekend. He found the airline counter and did most of the talking as I followed along, nodding as he spoke. I was grateful, and I kissed him when he handed me my ticket. Then we boarded a plane to Mexico, and as we walked down the aisle, we met eyes with Neville and Lana. Lana looked up from her book. Neville was cleaning his eyeglasses. For a moment, he didn't seem to trust his naked vision, so he put on his spectacles and smiled. "I had a feeling we hadn't seen the last of you," he said. I was happy as we settled into our seats. Then, suddenly, I was exhausted. I wasn't sure whether it was my current joy or my previous anxiety that had drained me more. In any case, I fell asleep on Mark's shoulder and stayed asleep the entire flight. When I woke up, we had just landed in what felt to me a world of possibility. Thank you.